The bodies piled up so fast in Tehran's Gadir hospital that distressed family members had to search through stacks of corpses to find their loved ones. It was January 9, 2026, and in just 48 hours, Iranian security forces had massacred an estimated 30,000 civilians in the streets. Snipers perched on rooftops deliberately aimed for heads, eyes, and genitals. Heavy DSHK machine guns mowed down unarmed protesters. The internet was cut. The world couldn't see. And the man who gave the direct order to put rioters in their place sat deep underground in a bunker so secure that its elevator took more than 5 minutes to descend. This was Ali Khamenei, and for 36 years he had ruled Iran with an iron fist that grew bloodier with each passing decade. But the story of how a mid-level cleric with questionable religious credentials became the most powerful dictator in the Middle East is a tale of cunning, paranoia, and systematic brutality that would ultimately end with 30 bombs falling from the sky on a February morning. In 1989, when Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, died, few expected Ali Khamenei to succeed him as supreme leader. At the time, Khamenei was serving as Iran's president, but he lacked the religious gravitas and scholarly credentials traditionally required for the position. He was, in the words of analysts who studied his rise, an unlikely candidate who knew himself and understood his vulnerabilities. Alex Vatanka, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, would later note that Khamenei didn't have the prestige, the gravitas, to be the successor to the founder of the Islamic Republic. The solution was elegant and cynical. Just months before Khomeini's death, Iran's constitution was quietly revised. Where it once required the supreme leader to possess the highest level of religious authority, it now stated that the leader needed only to be an expert in Islamic jurisprudence with political and managerial ability. The change was specifically designed to enable Khamenei's elevation. It was a constitutional coup disguised as administrative reform. Khamenei spent his first years in power being very nervous, according to historians. He understood that his legitimacy was questioned by more senior clerics and that his hold on power was tenuous. But he possessed something more valuable than religious credentials. He understood how to consolidate power through the barrel of a gun. And he had the perfect instrument to do it: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. The Revolutionary Guards had been founded during the chaos of the 1979 revolution as an ideological militia loyal to Khomeini and his vision of Islamic governance. Under Khamenei's leadership, the IRGC would transform from a revolutionary force into a vast military-industrial criminal empire that controlled not just Iran's security apparatus, but enormous swaths of its economy. While ordinary Iranians struggled with inflation, unemployment, and international sanctions, the IRGC commanders grew wealthy beyond measure, controlling construction companies, telecommunications networks, and smuggling operations. Khamenei's close relationship with the Revolutionary Guards was symbiotic. They provided him with the muscle to eliminate rivals and crush dissent. In return, he gave them economic monopolies and immunity from prosecution. Ali Vaez, director of the Iran project at the International Crisis Group, would later explain that Khamenei managed, on the back of the Revolutionary Guards, to increasingly appropriate all the levers of power in his hands and sideline everyone else. The IRGC became Khamenei's tool for projecting Iranian power beyond its borders. He tasked the Foreign Services Branch of the Revolutionary Guard, the Quds Force, with building a network of proxy militias across the Middle East. In Lebanon, they armed and funded Hezbollah. In the Gaza Strip, they supported Hamas. In Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, they organized, trained, and equipped Shiite militias that would fight in Iran's interests. This strategy served multiple purposes. It allowed Iran to wage war without directly risking Iranian territory. It spread Iranian influence across the region, and it gave the Revolutionary Guards opportunities for enrichment through arms deals and smuggling networks. But it was the IRGC's role in domestic repression that truly revealed Khamenei's character. Every time the Iranian people rose up to demand change, the Revolutionary Guards were there to beat them down with overwhelming violence. The pattern would repeat itself across decades, each crackdown bloodier than the last. The first major test came in July 1999. Student protesters at Tehran University demonstrated against the closure of a reformist newspaper. It was a relatively modest protest about press freedom. Khamenei's response was anything but modest. Military forces and plainclothes agents stormed the university dormitory in the middle of the night. Students were dragged from their beds, beaten with batons, and thrown from windows. Reports spoke of widespread arrests and the killing of several students. Some Revolutionary Guard commanders would later openly brag about their role in the violence. The message was clear. Even peaceful dissent would be met with brutal force. But Iranians, particularly Iran's young people, refused to be cowed. 75% of Iran's 90 million people had been born after the 1979 revolution. They had no memory of the Shah's regime or the revolutionary fervor that had overthrown it. What they saw was their country isolated, their economy strangled by sanctions, and their freedoms curtailed by aging clerics who seemed determined to keep Iran locked in the past. They watched as other countries in the region modernized and integrated with the international community, while Iran remained a pariah state. In 2009, these frustrations exploded into the largest protests since the revolution itself. The Green Movement began after a presidential election that was widely seen as fraudulent. The incumbent, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was declared the winner, despite credible reports of vote rigging and ballot stuffing. Millions of Iranians, convinced the election had been stolen, poured into the streets of Tehran and other cities. They wore green, the color of the opposition candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi. They chanted, "Where is my vote?" They demanded accountability. Khamenei could have ordered a recount. He could have launched an investigation into the fraud allegations. He could have sought compromise. Instead, he sided unequivocally with Ahmadinejad and the security apparatus. In a sermon at Tehran University, he praised the election as a divine assessment and warned protesters that they would be responsible for any bloodshed if they continued demonstrating. It was an explicit threat. Stop protesting, or we will kill you. The protesters didn't stop. On June 20, 2009, a young woman named Neda Aga Sultan was walking with her music teacher near the protests when she was shot by a besieged militiaman. The bullet struck her in the chest. She collapsed on the sidewalk, blood pouring from her mouth and nose. Her music teacher and bystanders tried desperately to stop the bleeding, but she died within minutes. A bystander captured the entire scene on a mobile phone camera. Within hours, the video had spread across the internet, broadcast by news channels around the world. Neda's death became the symbol of Khamenei's brutality. Here was a young woman, beautiful and innocent, who wasn't even participating in the protests, shot down by regime forces for the crime of being in the wrong place. Her eyes, staring blankly at the sky as life drained from her body, became the face of the Green Movement. International outrage followed, but Khamenei didn't care about international opinion. He cared about maintaining power, and that meant crushing the protests completely. Over the following weeks and months, thousands of Green Movement activists were arrested. Demonstrators were beaten in the streets. Protesters were taken to secret detention facilities where they were tortured. Some simply disappeared. The regime used rape as a weapon of intimidation, with male and female prisoners subjected to sexual violence to break their spirits. Human rights organizations documented systematic abuse, but Khamenei's government dismissed all allegations as foreign propaganda. The Green Movement eventually fizzled out, crushed by the weight of state repression. But Khamenei had learned an important lesson. Massive protests could be defeated if he was willing to use enough violence quickly enough. It was a lesson he would apply with even more brutality in the years to come. But crushing domestic dissent wasn't enough for Khamenei. He wanted to send a message that extended beyond Iran's borders. No one who criticized the regime would be safe, no matter where they fled. Under his watch, Iranian intelligence services launched a global campaign of intimidation against dissidents, journalists, and activists living in exile. The operations ranged from surveillance and harassment to kidnapping plots and assassination attempts. Among the most prominent targets was Masih Alinejad, an Iranian journalist and women's rights activist based in the United States. Alinejad had gained international attention for her campaign against Iran's mandatory hijab laws, encouraging Iranian women to post photos of themselves without head coverings as an act of defiance. The regime viewed her as a serious threat. According to U.S. law enforcement, Iranian intelligence services plotted multiple times to kidnap or kill Alinejad on American soil. In one plot uncovered by the FBI, Iranian operatives conducted extensive surveillance of her home in Brooklyn, taking photos and videos to plan an abduction. The message was chilling. Even in America, dissidents weren't safe. This wasn't an isolated case. Iranian operatives were implicated in assassination plots and attacks across Europe and the Middle East. In 2018, European authorities arrested an Iranian diplomat for plotting to bomb a rally of Iranian opposition groups in France. In 2020, Iranian agents were accused of surveilling and threatening dissidents in the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands. The pattern was consistent. Khamenei's regime would pursue its critics anywhere in the world, using whatever means necessary. The extrajudicial killings extended to Iran's regional operations as well. In Iraq, after the 2003 U.S. invasion, Khamenei saw an opportunity to exact revenge for decades of perceived American aggression. He tasked the Quds Force, led by the charismatic commander Qasem Soleimani, with arming and training Shiite militias to attack U.S. forces. The militias used sophisticated improvised explosive devices, many supplied directly by Iran, that were specifically designed to penetrate American armored vehicles. The weapons were devastating. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed or maimed by these Iranian-supplied IEDs, their bodies torn apart by explosively formed penetrators that could slice through steel. Khamenei showed no remorse for these deaths. In his worldview, America was the great Satan, the source of all evil in the world, and any violence against American forces was justified. He framed Iran's proxy wars as defensive measures, claiming that Iran was surrounded by hostile powers and needed to project strength to deter attacks. But the reality was that Khamenei's policies had isolated Iran and created the very security threats he claimed to be defending against. By the time Barack Obama became president in 2009, Iran's nuclear program had become a major international concern. Iran had been enriching uranium for years, claiming it was for peaceful energy purposes, but Western intelligence agencies believed the program was designed to give Iran the capability to build nuclear weapons. The international community imposed harsh economic sanctions on Iran, devastating its economy. Oil exports, the lifeblood of Iran's finances, were severely restricted. The value of Iran's currency, the rial, plummeted. Inflation soared. Ordinary Iranians suffered. In 2013, Khamenei reluctantly agreed to secret negotiations with the United States about Iran's nuclear program. He was deeply skeptical of any deal with America, but the economic pressure was becoming unsustainable. The negotiations were long and difficult, but they eventually resulted in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. Under the agreement, Iran would limit its nuclear enrichment activities and allow international inspectors into its facilities in exchange for sanctions relief. Khamenei's suspicions about American intentions seemed validated in 2018, when President Donald Trump, in his first term, withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal, despite Iran's compliance with its terms. Trump reimposed sanctions and added new ones, implementing a maximum pressure campaign designed to cripple Iran's economy. Khamenei responded by ordering Iranian scientists to begin enriching uranium to higher levels, moving Iran closer to the capability to build a nuclear weapon. It was a dangerous game of brinkmanship that would eventually lead to direct military confrontation. But before that confrontation came, Khamenei faced another major uprising from his own people. In November 2019, the government suddenly announced a dramatic increase in fuel prices. For Iranians already struggling with inflation and unemployment, this was the last straw. Within hours, protests erupted in cities across the country. What began as demonstrations about fuel prices quickly evolved into something much larger and more threatening to the regime: a fundamental rejection of the Islamic Republic itself. The protesters didn't just chant about economics. They shouted "Death to the dictator" in direct reference to Khamenei. They burned pictures of him in public, a serious criminal offense. They attacked banks and government buildings. The geographic scope and intensity of the protests terrified the regime. This wasn't limited to Tehran or other major cities. Protests spread to small towns and rural areas that had historically been regime strongholds. Khamenei's response was swift and merciless. He ordered a nationwide internet shutdown to prevent protesters from coordinating and to hide the regime's response from the outside world. Then, he gave security forces authorization to use lethal force. What followed was one of the deadliest crackdowns in modern Iranian history. According to a Reuters investigation based on leaked internal documents, approximately 1,500 people were killed in a matter of days. 18 of them were children. Security forces opened fire on crowds with live ammunition. They used heavy weapons typically reserved for warfare against unarmed civilians. Videos smuggled out of Iran showed bodies lying in the streets, their blood pooling on the pavement. The regime's official response was to deny everything. Government spokesmen claimed that the protesters were violent rioters armed by foreign powers. They said security forces had acted with restraint. They never provided an accurate death toll, and families of victims were threatened with arrest if they spoke publicly about their losses. But the truth leaked out through human rights organizations and journalists, who painstakingly documented the killings. The 2019 protests marked a turning point in how Iranians viewed their government. The social contract, such as it was, had been completely shattered. The regime no longer made any pretense of serving the people or responding to their grievances. It maintained power solely through fear and violence. Analysts noted that the protesters' slogans had evolved from demanding reform to explicitly calling for the overthrow of the entire system. Khamenei seemed unbothered by this loss of legitimacy. In his public statements, he continued to frame all dissent as foreign-inspired sedition. He blamed the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia for orchestrating the protests. He never acknowledged that perhaps Iranians were genuinely angry about corruption, repression, and economic mismanagement. To acknowledge the protesters' legitimate grievances would be to admit that his system had failed, and Khamenei's entire identity was bound up in the ideology of the Islamic Republic. He couldn't question the system without questioning himself. In September 2022, another wave of protests swept Iran, this time sparked by the death of a young woman in police custody. 22-year-old Mahsa Amini had been arrested by Iran's morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. While in custody, she fell into a coma and died. Witnesses said she had been beaten. The government claimed she had a heart attack. No one believed the official story. The protests that followed were remarkable for their breadth and boldness. Women ripped off their hijabs in public and burned them. They cut their hair in symbolic protest. The slogan, "Woman, Life, Freedom," became a rallying cry that echoed across Iran and around the world. Young women filmed themselves dancing in the streets without head coverings, an act that could result in arrest, torture, or even execution. The protests weren't just about the hijab. They were about the entire system of religious control that Khamenei represented. Once again, Khamenei's response was brutality. Security forces beat protesters in the streets. They arrested thousands, including many children and teenagers. Reports emerged of sexual violence against female detainees, torture, and forced confessions. The regime executed several protesters after sham trials, hanging them in public as a warning. Human rights organizations documented hundreds of deaths, though the true toll was likely higher given the regime's efforts to conceal casualties. By late 2025, Iran was a powder keg. Decades of mismanagement had devastated the economy. International sanctions had isolated the country. The government's legitimacy had eroded to the point where it existed only through violence. And Khamenei, now 86 years old and in declining health, seemed determined to maintain control at any cost. In December 2025, protests began again, initially over energy shortages and blackouts. Iranian cities were experiencing rolling power outages, leaving people without heat in the middle of winter. Water shortages were also endemic. The government's infrastructure had crumbled, and its promises to fix the problems rang hollow. But this time, the protests escalated faster and more dramatically than ever before. The crowds grew larger. The slogans grew more radical. Protesters didn't just attack symbols of government authority. They began attacking symbols of religious authority as well. In one shocking incident, protesters in Hamadan were seen setting fire to a Quran and attempting to storm a mosque before being stopped by security forces. The act was intended as a direct repudiation of the Islamic Republic's entire ideological foundation. Women participated in these protests in unprecedented numbers. Videos circulated on social media showing Iranian women lighting cigarettes with burning photographs of Khamenei, a gesture loaded with symbolism and defiance. Burning the supreme leader's image was a serious criminal offense that could result in lengthy prison sentences, but these women no longer cared. They were sending a message that they rejected Khamenei's authority over their lives, their bodies, and their futures. The regime's response followed the familiar pattern: mass arrests, internet shutdowns, and lethal violence. But this time, something felt different. The protests weren't dying down. They were spreading and intensifying. By early January 2026, demonstrations had erupted in dozens of cities simultaneously. The geographic scope was unprecedented. Reports came in of protests in small towns and rural areas that had never before seen anti-government demonstrations. On January 10, 2026, Khamenei delivered a televised address that would prove darkly prophetic. He acknowledged that many protesters had completely fair economic grievances. But then he added a chilling caveat: rioters must be put in their place. It was an order. 2 days later, the Tehran prosecutor's office announced that protesters would be charged with moharebe, waging war against God, an offense punishable by death under Iranian law. The regime was preparing to mass execute demonstrators. Intelligence reports from sources inside Iran's Supreme National Security Council would later reveal that Khamenei personally authorized the use of live fire against protesters. He gave the Revolutionary Guards explicit permission to kill as many people as necessary to end the demonstrations. The IRGC, loyal to Khamenei above all else, prepared to carry out what would become one of the largest massacres of civilians in modern history. January 8, 2026, would go down as one of the darkest days in Iranian history. That's when Khamenei's final solution was implemented. The internet went dark across Iran at exactly 2:47 a.m. on January 8, 2026. Within minutes, Iran became the world's largest digital black hole. No social media, no messaging apps, no way for Iranians to communicate with each other or the outside world. The blackout was deliberate and comprehensive, designed to hide what was about to happen from international observers. What the regime didn't anticipate was that some information would still leak out, carried by satellite phones, smuggled USB drives, and brave individuals who risked everything to document the atrocities. At dawn, Revolutionary Guard units deployed across Tehran and dozens of other cities. They arrived in armored vehicles, carrying not just assault rifles, but heavy weapons typically used in warfare. DSHK heavy machine guns, designed to take down aircraft and pierce armored vehicles, were mounted on trucks and positioned at major intersections. Snipers took positions on rooftops overlooking areas where protests were expected. The deployment was massive, coordinated, and prepared for one purpose: mass killing. The protesters came out anyway. Despite knowing the danger, despite seeing the military hardware arrayed against them, thousands of Iranians took to the streets on the morning of January 8th. They chanted "Death to Khamenei" and "Death to the dictator." They carried handmade signs demanding freedom. In some cities, they managed to overwhelm police barriers and march toward government buildings. For a few brief hours, it seemed like the sheer number of protesters might overcome the security forces. Then the shooting started. Security forces didn't fire warning shots. They didn't aim for legs or try to disperse crowds with less lethal weapons. They aimed for center mass, for heads, for maximum lethality. The DSHK machine guns opened up on crowds, their heavy rounds tearing through multiple bodies at once. Snipers picked off individuals who appeared to be leaders or organizers. Within minutes, the streets were covered in blood and bodies. A doctor working at a Tehran hospital would later describe the scene to international media. "They were shooting to kill. We received dozens of bodies with gunshot wounds to the head, chest, and vital organs. Some had been shot in the eyes. Some had been shot in the genitals. It was clear that security forces were deliberately trying to inflict maximum damage and suffering." The Guardian newspaper obtained evidence that security forces were using not just assault rifles, but also shotguns loaded with buckshot at close range, deliberately targeting protesters' faces and eyes. A spokesperson from the Abdurrahman Burman Center for Human Rights analyzed videos and medical reports, concluding that, even when using less lethal weapons, security forces were deliberately shooting at the heads, eyes, genitals, and vital organs of protesters. By the afternoon of January 8th, hospitals in Tehran and other major cities were overwhelmed. Emergency rooms filled beyond capacity with gunshot victims. Doctors and nurses worked frantically to save lives, but many of the wounds were unsurvivable. The hallways filled with bodies waiting to be identified by family members. At Ghadir Hospital in Tehran, human rights organizations verified disturbing video footage showing distressed family members searching through literal piles of corpses, trying to identify their loved ones by clothing or jewelry, because facial identification was often impossible due to the severity of injuries. But January 8th was just the beginning. On January 9th, the killing intensified. The death toll from those 2 days alone would eventually be estimated at somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people. The exact number may never be known because the regime prevented accurate counting and threatened families who tried to speak publicly about their losses. Bodies were buried quickly in mass graves. Families were sometimes prevented from holding proper funerals. The regime was trying to erase the evidence of its crimes. On January 13th, the Tehran prosecutor's office made good on its threat to charge protesters with moharabeh, waging war against God. The announcement stated that an undisclosed number of detainees would face this charge, which carried a mandatory death sentence under Iranian law. The regime had used this charge before to execute political prisoners, but never on this scale. Human rights lawyers estimated that thousands of detainees could potentially face execution. The One Word Lawyers Network, a group of Iranian human rights attorneys, issued a desperate plea to the international community. With the internet shutdown isolating protesters from outside help, they called on international judges and organizations to pressure Iran to prevent the show trials and mass executions that were clearly being planned. But the reality was that international pressure had limited effect on a regime that had long since stopped caring about its international reputation. Funerals for victims became sites of secondary protests, with mourners refusing to remain silent despite the danger. In Fuladshar, Kudasht, and Marvdasht, families holding funerals for killed protesters chanted "Death to Khamenei," even as security forces watched. At one funeral in Kudasht for a young man named Kodayari Fard, mourners physically chased away Basij and IRGC forces with stones and angry chants. The victim's father courageously confirmed to journalists that his son had not been a Basij member, contradicting regime claims that the young man had been killed by protesters rather than security forces. Even in the face of overwhelming violence, Iranian women continued their remarkable campaign of resistance. The viral trend of women lighting cigarettes with burning photographs of Khamenei continued and even intensified during the January massacres. These were not anonymous acts done in the safety of private homes. Women filmed themselves in public spaces, their faces clearly visible, committing what Iranian law considered a serious criminal offense. They were explicitly rejecting the supreme leader's authority and daring the regime to come after them. NDTV and other international media outlets reported on this phenomenon as a direct challenge to the country's political and religious authority. The symbolism was multi-layered. Women smoking, forbidden under strict interpretations of Islamic law, burning the supreme leader's image, a criminal offense, and filming themselves doing it, evidence that could be used for prosecution. These women knew the risks and did it anyway. Many would later be arrested, but their videos had already spread across the internet, inspiring others. The protesters' slogans had evolved to explicitly call for Khamenei's death. "This year is the year of blood. Khamenei will be overthrown," they chanted. The remarkable thing about these chants was that they were no longer confined to opposition groups or dissidents. Ordinary Iranians, from all walks of life and all regions of the country, were openly calling for the dictator's removal. The fear that had kept Iranians silent for decades had finally been overcome. By mid-January, international estimates of the death toll varied wildly. The Iranian government initially claimed that only a few hundred people had died and that most were security force members killed by violent protesters. No one believed these figures. Independent monitoring groups put the toll at over 5,000 confirmed dead by January 14th, with another 10,000 cases still under investigation. CBS News, citing activist groups, reported that the death toll might be as high as 20,000. The Sunday Times published an estimate of 16,000 to 18,000 killed, with 330,000 injured. Then, on January 17th, Khamenei himself made a stunning admission. In a speech broadcast by Iranian state media, he acknowledged that several thousand people had been killed during the protests. It was a rare moment of partial honesty from the supreme leader, though he immediately undercut it by claiming the violence had been caused by external enemies, specifically the United States and Israel. According to Khamenei, foreign intelligence services had orchestrated the unrest and provided weapons to demonstrators. It was the same excuse he had used for decades, and it was no more believable now than it had been in the past. An Iranian official speaking to Reuters on condition of anonymity provided a different figure. The government's internal estimates put the death toll at over 5,000. By January 22nd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran stated that the number of civilians killed might surpass 20,000. The human rights activists' news agency updated its verified death count to 4,714 adult protesters, 42 minors, 207 security force members, and 39 non-participants, with an additional 9,798 deaths still under investigation. The numbers kept climbing as more information leaked out of Iran despite the internet blackout. The UN Special Rapporteur made another significant statement. The evidence justified investigating whether the killings constituted crimes against humanity under international law. She suggested that the mandate of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran could be extended to investigate the massacres and determine whether Ali Khamenei should be referred to the International Criminal Court for prosecution. Human Rights Watch and the International Commission of Jurists echoed this call, demanding that the fact-finding mission be given sufficient resources to conduct a thorough investigation. On January 28th, a group of prominent Iranian lawyers and intellectuals published a statement on Instagram asserting that the killings were indeed crimes against humanity. The signatories included well-known human rights defenders like Nasrin Sotoudeh, filmmaker Jafar Panahi, and several other brave individuals. The statement attributed principal responsibility to Khamenei personally. Within 3 days, 3 of the signatories, Mehdi Mahmoudian, Abdullah Momeni, and Vida Rabbani, were arrested. The regime was making clear that even documenting its crimes was itself a crime. The legal definition of crimes against humanity includes acts such as murder, torture, rape, and persecution committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. The January massacres clearly met these criteria. Sources close to Iran's Supreme National Security Council confirmed that the killings had been carried out on Khamenei's direct orders, with full approval from senior state officials. The Security Council had explicitly authorized the use of live fire, which was then executed mainly by the IRGC in what sources described as a deliberate, organized operation exceptional in scale and intensity. As the death toll mounted and international condemnation grew, Khamenei retreated from public view. He had always been somewhat reclusive, but after the January massacres, he became almost invisible. His rare public appearances were brief and heavily scripted. He no longer visited public spaces or interacted with ordinary citizens. Instead, he spent most of his time in his compound in Tehran, protected by layers of security and increasingly paranoid about potential threats. The compound itself was a fortress. Built over decades and expanded numerous times, it featured underground bunkers, secure communications facilities, and accommodations for Khamenei's family and closest advisors. The deepest bunker was so far underground that its elevator took more than 5 minutes to reach it. This wasn't an exaggeration or metaphor. Engineers who had worked on the facility confirmed that the vertical shaft extended hundreds of feet below the surface, designed to withstand even direct hits from bunker-buster bombs. Khamenei's paranoia had intensified dramatically after the 12-day war in June 2025. That conflict, which saw massive Israeli and American airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and military targets, had nearly killed him. He had survived by staying deep underground for the duration of the strikes, but the experience had left him shaken. Intelligence agencies tracking his movements noted that after the 12-day war, Khamenei rarely came above ground. When he did venture to the surface, it was only for brief periods and with extraordinary security precautions. The opportunities to strike Khamenei were becoming increasingly rare. The CIA had been tracking his movements and patterns for months, trying to find a moment of vulnerability. But Khamenei's security protocols were sophisticated. He varied his schedule unpredictably. He used body doubles for some public appearances. His communications were heavily encrypted. And most importantly, he spent the vast majority of his time deep underground, where he was essentially untouchable by conventional weapons. But Khamenei's bunker, as secure as it was also a prison. He was trapped underground by his own paranoia, cut off from the country he ruled. He relied on reports from security officials and state media for information about what was happening above ground, but these sources had every incentive to downplay the scale of public opposition. Khamenei may not have fully understood just how much ordinary Iranians hated him. In early January 2026, intelligence reports from multiple sources revealed something extraordinary. Khamenei had developed a backup plan to flee Iran entirely if the regime began to collapse. The evacuation route led to Moscow. Russia, which had maintained close ties with Iran for decades and had supported the regime diplomatically and militarily, had apparently agreed to provide Khamenei with sanctuary if necessary. The plan, dubbed Plan B by Iranian officials, involved a covert flight from Tehran to a Russian military base, from which Khamenei would be transported to Moscow. The existence of Plan B revealed the supreme leader's awareness that his regime might not survive. Despite his public bravado and his speeches about divine protection and the righteousness of the Islamic Republic, Khamenei privately understood that his hold on power was tenuous. The January massacres were a desperate attempt to terrorize Iranians into submission, to show them that the price of resistance would always be death. But massacres, no matter how brutal, can't permanently suppress a population that has lost its fear. The Kremlin never officially confirmed the evacuation plan, but Russian President Vladimir Putin's response to later events suggested that the relationship between Russia and Khamenei was indeed very close. Russia had its own strategic reasons for supporting Iran. The two countries shared interests in opposing American influence in the Middle East, maintaining high oil prices, and supporting Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. For Putin, Khamenei's Iran was a useful partner, and preserving the Islamic Republic served Russian geopolitical goals. As January turned to February, the situation in Iran remained volatile. The internet was partially restored in some areas, allowing information about the massacres to finally reach the outside world. The images and videos that emerged were horrifying. Streets stained with blood, hospitals overflowing with casualties, grieving families, and defiant protesters still chanting against the regime despite everything. International human rights organizations scrambled to document the atrocities before evidence could be destroyed. President Donald Trump, back in the White House for his second term, watched the situation carefully. His administration had pursued a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, imposing severe economic sanctions designed to force the regime to abandon its nuclear program and its support for terrorism. But the sanctions had also contributed to the economic desperation that fueled the protests. Trump faced a dilemma. He wanted the Iranian regime to fall, but he also didn't want to launch another major Middle Eastern war. His advisors were divided on whether to intervene militarily. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had no such hesitation. Israel had been engaged in an escalating shadow war with Iran for years, with both sides carrying out covert strikes, assassinations, and sabotage operations. The June 2025 12-day war had been the most intense direct confrontation between the two countries, but it had ended inconclusively. Netanyahu believed that Khamenei's regime needed to be completely destroyed, not just weakened, and he thought the January massacres, by demonstrating the regime's complete moral bankruptcy, had created the perfect justification for decisive action. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies from the United States, Israel, and several other countries were coordinating more closely than ever. They shared information about the Iranian regime's vulnerabilities, military capabilities, and leadership locations. The CIA continued its meticulous tracking of Khamenei's movements, looking for the right moment to strike. Israeli intelligence provided detailed mapping of Iranian command and control facilities. Saudi Arabia, long Iran's regional rival, offered intelligence support and encouragement for military action. The pieces were falling into place for a decisive confrontation. Khamenei, isolated in his bunker and increasingly paranoid, had become a prisoner of his own security measures. The Iranian people had lost all fear of the regime and were demanding change despite the staggering cost. International pressure was mounting for accountability for the January massacres, and most importantly, American and Israeli intelligence had finally figured out how to find and target the supreme leader, even in his heavily fortified compound. The massacre had been Khamenei's final attempt to crush opposition through pure terror, but it had backfired spectacularly. Instead of cowing Iranians into submission, the killings had destroyed whatever remaining legitimacy the regime possessed. Instead of discouraging international intervention, the massacres had provided moral justification for military action. Khamenei had sealed his own fate. He just didn't know it yet. In late February, CIA analysts identified a pattern in Khamenei's schedule. Despite his paranoia and security precautions, there were certain meetings he couldn't avoid. Senior military and security officials needed regular access to him to coordinate the regime's response to the ongoing crisis. These meetings, by necessity, required Khamenei to come above ground to his office, where communication systems were more sophisticated than in the deep bunker. The meetings were unpredictable in timing, but when they happened, Khamenei would be vulnerable for a window of several hours. American intelligence received confirmation that such a meeting was scheduled for the morning of February 28th. Multiple senior officials would be present, including leaders of the IRGC and key advisors. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Within hours, the information was shared with Israeli military planners. The coordination between American and Israeli forces began immediately. The operation would be called Epic Fury by the Americans and Roaring Lion by the Israelis. The goal was not just to kill Khamenei, but to decapitate the entire Iranian regime in a single strike, killing as many senior leaders as possible simultaneously to prevent an organized response. Additional strikes would target nuclear facilities, missile production sites, and military command centers across Iran. At 8:10 a.m. Tehran time on February 28, 2026, the sky above Iran's capital exploded with fire and thunder. 30 Israeli F-35 stealth fighters, invisible to Iranian radar, had penetrated the country's airspace and were now screaming toward their targets at supersonic speeds. At the same moment, American B-2 Spirit stealth bombers launched cruise missiles from positions over the Persian Gulf. The coordinated strike package included over 300 precision-guided munitions aimed at targets across 24 Iranian provinces. But the primary target, the one that mattered most, was a compound in northern Tehran where Ali Khamenei was meeting with his senior commanders. The first bombs hit Khamenei's compound at 8:12 a.m. Witnesses on nearby streets described a massive, wildly bold daytime attack that sent shockwaves across the city. The explosions were so powerful that windows shattered miles away. Huge plumes of thick black smoke rose into the morning sky, visible from across Tehran. For the next several minutes, wave after wave of bombs struck the compound, systematically destroying every building, every bunker entrance, every possible hiding place. Israeli jets dropped exactly 30 bombs on Khamenei's residence complex. The weapons were a mix of 2,000-pound bunker busters designed to penetrate deep underground and smaller precision munitions aimed at surface structures. The strategy was to seal off the deep bunkers first, trapping anyone inside, then systematically destroy the compound level by level. Military analysts would later describe it as one of the most precisely coordinated airstrikes in modern warfare, with each bomb timed to maximize damage and prevent any possibility of escape. Khamenei had been in his office on the ground floor of the main residence building when the attack began. According to intelligence reconstructed after the strike, he had been meeting with at least 5 senior advisors and military commanders. The meeting had been scheduled to discuss the regime's response to continued protests and international pressure following the January massacres. The attendees included Defense Minister Amir Nasirzadeh, IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour, Armed Forces Chief of Staff Mohammad Bagheri, and Ali Khamenei, one of Khamenei's closest advisors. All of them would die in the next 2 minutes. The first bomb to hit the main residence building was a GBU-28 bunker buster. It struck the roof and penetrated through 4 floors before detonating. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire building collapsed inward, crushing everyone inside under tons of concrete and steel. Khamenei, 86 years old and in poor health, would have died instantly. But the Israeli pilots weren't taking any chances. They continued bombing the rubble for several more minutes, ensuring that no one could possibly survive. Also in the compound at the time of the strike were members of Khamenei's immediate family. His daughter, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, and a grandchild had been visiting him that morning. All of them died in the bombing. A member of the Tehran City Council would later confirm these deaths, though the regime initially tried to suppress information about the family casualties. The Iranian government wanted to frame Khamenei as a martyr who died alone in service to his country, not as a grandfather killed alongside his family. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas called Khamenei's death a defining moment in Iran's history, and said that what comes next is uncertain, but there is now an open path to a different Iran, one that its people may have greater freedom to shape. The statement was carefully calibrated to acknowledge the significance of the moment, without explicitly endorsing assassination as a tool of foreign policy. But Iran's allies condemned the strike in the strongest terms. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the assassination unacceptable and a blatant killing of a sovereign leader. In a call with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Wang expressed concern that the situation in the Middle East may be pushed into a dangerous abyss. China's statement emphasized violations of international law and the basic norms of international relations. Russia's response was even more forceful. President Vladimir Putin called the assassination a cynical murder and sent condolences to Iranian President Pezeshkian. Putin said that Khamenei's assassination is a violation of all standards of human morality and international law. The Russian statement reflected not just diplomatic solidarity with an ally, but genuine concern about the precedent being set. If America and Israel could assassinate Iran's head of state with impunity, what prevented similar operations against Russian officials? Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said he was saddened by Khamenei's death and pledged that Turkey would continue diplomatic efforts to regain peace and stability. It was a notably mild statement from a leader who had to balance his country's NATO membership with his desire to maintain good relations with Iran. North Korea's foreign ministry issued a statement calling the strikes illegal aggression and a violation of national sovereignty. For authoritarian regimes like North Korea and China, the assassination of Khamenei was deeply threatening because it demonstrated that even the most protected dictator could be reached by American military power. Perhaps the most striking international reaction came from Ukraine. The official Ukrainian government X account posted, "Nothing beats the death of a dictator." The message reflected Ukraine's perspective as a country fighting for survival against Russian aggression, viewing Iran as an enemy because of its support for Russia through weapons sales and military cooperation. For Ukrainians, Khamenei's death weakened one of Russia's key allies. But while diplomats issued carefully worded statements, the more immediate question was what Iran would do next. Within hours of confirming Khamenei's death, the IRGC issued a statement threatening the most intense offensive operation against American and Israeli targets. The statement warned that attacks would begin in moments and urged civilians in Israel and at American military bases across the Middle East to seek shelter. The IRGC's threat was not idle. Starting on the evening of March 1st, Iran launched approximately 300 ballistic missiles at targets in Israel and at American military installations in Iraq, Syria, and the Persian Gulf. The missiles were a mix of older Shahab models and newer, more accurate Imad and Ghadr missiles. Israeli air defenses, aided by American Patriot and THAAD systems, intercepted most of the incoming missiles, but some got through. At least 6 people were killed in Israel by missile impacts. At an American consulate in Karachi, Pakistan, protesters stormed the building, killing 6 people and injuring 8 others before being dispersed by security forces. The Iranian missile strikes were more an expression of rage than an effective military response. They didn't change the strategic situation or reverse the decapitation of Iran's leadership. But they did demonstrate that Iran, even after losing Khamenei and many senior commanders, still had the capability to strike back. They also showed that the crisis was far from over, and that the potential for wider war remained very real. Trump responded to the Iranian missile strikes with a warning posted on Truth Social in all capital letters. They better not do that, however, because if they do, we will hit them with a force that has never been seen before. The message, characteristically bombastic, was intended to deter further Iranian retaliation. But it also raised the prospect of an escalation spiral that could lead to full-scale war. As the immediate shock of Khamenei's death began to wear off, attention turned to the question of succession. Under Iran's constitution, when the supreme leader dies, an assembly of experts is supposed to convene to select his replacement. The assembly is a body of 88 Islamic jurists elected by popular vote, but heavily vetted by the regime to ensure loyalty. In theory, they could select anyone they deemed qualified to be supreme leader, and the position is supposed to be for life. But the constitution was written for normal circumstances, not for a situation where the supreme leader had been assassinated during military strikes and the country was in crisis. Within hours of Khamenei's death, 3 officials were announced as forming an interim leadership council. President Masoud Pezeshkian, Chief Justice Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, and Ali Reza Arafi, a member of the Assembly of Experts. This council would temporarily exercise the powers of the supreme leader, while the assembly convened to select a permanent replacement. Ali Larijani, who had been appointed head of the Supreme National Security Council by Khamenei just before his death, emerged as a key power broker in the immediate aftermath. Larijani had been a close advisor to Khamenei for years and understood the inner workings of the regime better than almost anyone. In a televised statement, he tried to project calm and continuity, saying that Iran had assured regional leaders it was not seeking war, but would continue to target American bases in retaliation for the strikes. But behind the scenes, Iranian politics were in chaos. Multiple factions within the regime saw Khamenei's death as an opportunity to advance their own agendas. Hardliners in the IRGC wanted someone who would continue Khamenei's confrontational approach toward the West. Pragmatists argued that Iran needed a leader who could negotiate an end to sanctions and international isolation. And there were rumors that some officials were considering fundamental reforms to Iran's political system, perhaps even abolishing the position of supreme leader entirely and moving toward a more conventional republic. Several names emerged as potential successors to Khamenei. Mojtaba Khamenei, Ali Khamenei's son, had long been rumored as his father's preferred choice, but nepotistic succession was controversial even among regime loyalists. Hassan Khomeini, grandson of the Islamic Republic's founder, had name recognition and religious credentials, but was considered too reformist by hardliners. Various senior clerics and IRGC commanders were also mentioned as possibilities. But analysts noted that none of the potential successors had Khamenei's combination of religious authority, political cunning, and institutional support. The position of supreme leader had been created specifically for Ruhollah Khomeini in 1979, and both he and Ali Khamenei had spent decades consolidating the office's powers. Whoever succeeded Khamenei would inherit the title, but not necessarily the power, and they would face immediate challenges from other factions. The Council on Foreign Relations, a prominent American think tank, published analysis arguing that taking out Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is not the same as regime change. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is the regime. The analysis noted that while Khamenei's death was symbolically important, the real power structure in Iran was the IRGC and its vast network of economic and military interests. Unless the IRGC was dismantled, the analysis argued, Iran would likely continue to be an authoritarian state, even with a new leader. This analysis highlighted a fundamental question. What would Iran become after Khamenei? The optimistic scenario, favored by Trump and Netanyahu, was that his death would trigger a popular uprising that would sweep away the entire Islamic Republic and lead to a democratic government. The pessimistic scenario was that the IRGC would consolidate power, install a puppet leader, and continue the regime's policies with even more militaristic aggression. The most likely scenario, many analysts thought, was something in between, a period of instability and political maneuvering that could go in multiple directions, depending on how internal and external actors responded. For ordinary Iranians, the days after Khamenei's death were a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The celebrations in the streets reflected genuine joy at the dictator's demise, but thoughtful Iranians understood that his death alone wouldn't solve their country's problems. The economy was still in shambles. International sanctions remained in place. The IRGC still controlled vast swaths of Iranian society, and there was no clear path forward toward the freedom and prosperity that so many Iranians desired. Reza Pahlavi, the eldest son of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, who was overthrown in 1979, issued a statement saying that any attempt to appoint a successor to Khamenei is doomed to fail from the outset. Pahlavi, who lived in exile and had positioned himself as a potential leader of a post-Islamic Republic Iran, called for Iranians to seize this moment to create a new political system based on democracy and human rights. But Pahlavi's credibility was limited by his family's history. Many Iranians blamed the Shah's authoritarian rule and corruption for creating the conditions that led to the Islamic Revolution in the first place. The Iranian opposition in exile was deeply fragmented. Various groups advocated for different visions of Iran's future. Monarchists, who wanted to restore the Pahlavi dynasty, secular Democrats, who wanted a republic, leftists, who wanted socialism, and ethnic minorities, who wanted greater autonomy or independence. This fragmentation was one of the regime's greatest sources of strength. As long as the opposition couldn't unite around a common alternative, the Islamic Republic could present itself as the only option capable of holding Iran together. Intelligence analysts noted that regimes don't usually collapse just because their leader dies. They collapse when security forces refuse to fire on protesters, when economic conditions become unbearable, when external powers intervene decisively, or when a credible alternative government emerges. None of these conditions were clearly present in Iran in early March 2026. The IRGC remained loyal to the regime and willing to use violence. The economy was terrible, but not in complete collapse. American and Israeli strikes had been devastating, but limited to military targets rather than an invasion. And there was no unified opposition ready to step into power. On March 2nd, 48 hours after the assassination, satellite imagery showed massive crowds gathering in Tehran for Khamenei's funeral. The regime had organized the event as a show of strength, bussing in supporters from across the country and using state television to broadcast the proceedings. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets, many carrying portraits of Khamenei and chanting religious slogans. The message was clear. The Islamic Republic was not going to collapse quietly. But other images from that same day showed ongoing protests in Isfahan, Shiraz, and other cities, with demonstrators chanting "No to the Islamic Republic" and demanding fundamental change. The dueling images captured Iran's divided reality, a country split between those who mourned Khamenei and those who celebrated his death, between those who wanted to preserve the system and those who wanted to destroy it. International attention began to focus on what Trump and Netanyahu would do next. Both leaders had called for regime change, but neither had articulated a clear plan for what came after Khamenei's death. Would American and Israeli forces launch additional strikes to destroy the IRGC? Would they support opposition groups with weapons and intelligence? Would they attempt to broker negotiations between different Iranian factions? Or would they simply wait to see what happened, letting Iranians determine their own fate? The school strikes haunted the operation. Images of the destroyed Shajareh Tayyebe Girls' Elementary School circulated widely, with human rights organizations demanding investigations into whether the strikes constituted war crimes. Parents of the 108 killed children became international symbols of the civilian cost of military operations. Critics argued that targeting Khamenei, however morally justified, couldn't excuse the killing of innocent children. Defenders of the operation argued that the school strikes were tragic mistakes in an otherwise successful mission, and that Khamenei's decades of atrocities dwarfed the civilian casualties from the February 28th attacks. The controversy over the school strikes highlighted the moral complexity of assassination as a tool of statecraft. Killing a dictator responsible for tens of thousands of deaths might be justified as preventing future atrocities. But if that assassination also kills dozens of children, does it remain justified? Different people reached different conclusions, and the debate would continue for years. By March 3rd, 5 days after the assassination, a pattern had emerged. Iran was experiencing a crisis of legitimacy and leadership, but not a revolution. The IRGC remained in control of security. The government continued to function, albeit with reduced effectiveness. Protests continued, but were smaller than in January, perhaps because people were waiting to see what would happen with the succession. International attention remained intense, but the immediate threat of wider war had receded slightly, as both Iran and the U.S.-Israel coalition avoided major escalation. The question of whether Khamenei's assassination would lead to meaningful change in Iran remained unanswered. His death had removed a brutal dictator who had ruled for 36 years and killed thousands of his own people. But it hadn't dismantled the system of repression he had built. The IRGC, the hardline clerics, the intelligence services, and the vast network of regime loyalists all survived. They were weakened, shocked, and uncertain about the future, but they were still there. For the Iranian people, Khamenei's death represented a moment of possibility. The dictator who had terrorized them for nearly 4 decades was gone. The fear that had paralyzed Iranian society for so long had been broken. Whatever happened next, Iranians knew that they had the power to shape their own destiny if they were willing to fight for it. The January massacres had shown the regime's brutality. The February 28th assassination had shown its vulnerability. History would judge whether Operation Epic Fury was a strategic success or a reckless act that destabilized an already volatile region. But one thing was certain. Ali Khamenei, the mid-level cleric who had become one of the world's most brutal dictators, was dead. His 36-year reign of terror had ended not with a peaceful transition, but with 30 bombs from the sky. And Iran, a country of 90 million people with a rich history and an uncertain future, stood at a crossroads, its fate yet to be determined.